Next, from Springfield, we speak one-on-one with Congressman John Shimkus about the growing federal debt and the need to reform entitlement programs that now account for the vast majority of the federal budget. This runs about 30 minutes. Congressman John Shimkus, thank you for joining us again on the Illinois Channel.
It's great to be back with you. Thanks for having me.
As we tape this at the end of November, we have just had the super committee, so-called, fail to reach an agreement on cutting $1.2 trillion out of the federal budget over a 10-year period. Now that will supposedly trigger automatic spending cuts in both military and the Medicaid program. Why don't we start just with your overview of A, that process, and B, given the amount of increasing federal debt, what do you see as where we should be going to address that?
Yeah, that's a great question. First of all, the super committee turned out to be not too super. It was our attempt to kind of simplify the process like a BRAC committee, get it in the hands of a equally divided bipartisan group, understanding the challenges that our country faces, which are national debt and a deficit, and hoping that they would come to the table with a product that would at least get you to 1.2, maybe 1.5. Many of us were really cheering for them to go long, which was $4.5 trillion. They couldn't do it. Not without a lot of people encouraging them. I really wanted to succeed. I put my arm around them. I didn't sign letters. I didn't try to interfere with the work. They had enough challenges without 429 members and 94 senators trying to weigh in on this committee that we've empowered them to try to get to compromise. Again, having said that, they weren't successful, so they're not putting me and many members of Congress on the near-term hook on approving what they decided. I mean, that's what we were hoping we would be debating. Here is what they decided. Shimkus, how are you going to vote? Well, I don't have to worry about that right now. We've got to worry about getting through the end of the fiscal year, either through a CR or through 9 appropriation bills, and then going back in January and start addressing the 2013 budget. Super committee's $1.2 trillion starts with fiscal year 2013, and it is, as you adequately said, it's really a national defense silo, which is armed services, homeland security, and intel. And then there's a health and human services silo, which is primarily Medicaid and mostly discretionary administration of these programs and healthcare plans. The argument was that both these two silos are both going to be so tough to just take a whack at that you wanted it to get managed by the legislative process. Well, we failed to do that, so now the whack will come unless we policy-wise make decisions within the next year to how to get the same amount of savings differently.
Well, let me interject. So on the analysis that we heard on some of the national news, people were saying, well, those who are democratically leaning say we didn't come to an agreement on the super committee because the Republicans failed to compromise on no new taxes. The Republicans offered apparently some new revenue through other means, but not an increase in taxes. Of course, I guess the Republicans, I'll let you speak for them, would say the Democrats didn't want to cut enough. How do we get past, as a people, this impasse? Because while we politically dawdle, we still spend more than we're taking in. We still run up higher and higher interest rates. And many economists feel that the United States could have an economic implosion. The dollar could collapse, as we are actually seeing states over in Europe, such as Greece, and now the fear, of course, is Italy. Where do we go? How do we get past this impasse so that we don't just have the dollar collapse?
Yeah, and you adequately address we spend more than we take in. And so that's where a lot of us saying it's really a spending issue, not a revenue issue. We did put revenue on the table. I think that surprised people. And then when we put revenue on the table, it says, oh, you're not putting enough revenue on the table. Listen, our national debt and our deficit is really driven by Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, interest on the debt, and the discretionary budget. Now, because the super committee failed, the 1.2 is going to have to come out of the discretionary budget, which is only like 1/5 of the spending.
Right, it's actually the discretionary part. The part that you make up every year is a limited portion of the budget.
So if you really want to address the now $15 trillion national debt, you have to actuarially reform the entitlement programs. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. States have been trying to do that. Illinois has failed to limit Medicaid eligibility. That affects the national perspective because we're a 50% payer of Medicaid. So you could, again, who's qualified to go on the Medicaid rolls? Who's qualified and when should you receive Medicare? Who's qualified and when should you receive Social Security?
So you're saying we need to reform the entitlement program?
Oh, they all have to be reformed. And any
with the result that the Fed, I mean, obviously there's no point in reforming them to spend more. You got to reform them to spend less.
You've got to reform them to make sure they are financially viable for future generations.
Are they viable now?
No, they're all going to go bankrupt. They're all going broke. So this is no different than the state of Illinois in their pension obligations. This is no different than major corporate America and what they call their legacy costs. Their promises to pay their retirees health care and pension benefits. As through great health care, people live longer. And actuarially, the promises made can't be sustained with the graying baby boom population. So that's where you're going to get the $4 to $5 trillion in actuary savings that really will help bend the national debt curve
in the entitlements.
In the entitlement programs.
And what would you support? What are your thoughts?
Yeah.
I mean, I presume you've thought about this. We have, again, let's go Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and for the sake of the argument or the audience, I would say let's say entitlement spending as compared to when we talk about discretionary. Entitlement spending is on automatic pilot.
Right.
Once you hit the trigger, let's say in Social Security of 62 or 65, whenever you opt, the government starts spending money on you because you're entitled.
Right.
It's not where you say we're only going to spend so much money every year.
Right.
Would you support reforming Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and if so, have you given any thoughts to how they might be changed?
Yeah, and none of this is new. I mean, I always go back to Senator Moynihan from New York, who raised this issue 20 years ago. Senator Paul Simon talked about reforming the entitlement programs. So, yeah, what would you do? Let's take Social Security. It's the easiest one to fix. Actuarially, and if you actuarially reform these, it's really the less painful way to do it, because all you're doing is trying to push out your obligations or bring in more revenue, raising the ceiling on what's taxable under the Social Security, the FICA tax. Right now, if you make over $106,500, you pay the same as someone who makes $106,000. So if you make $150,000, you're paying.
So you stop paying Social Security FICA tax once you go past $106,000.
Right.
So if you earn $1 million, you only pay the FICA tax on $106,000.
That's right. So that would be a simple, and I think people would agree with that. It might affect some small
Would you
business.
raise the cap or remove the cap?
You could do either. I mean, when you're.
I mean, do you have a preference?
No. I mean, just doing that is reform. The problem in this whole debate is that is Social Security reform.
What about raising the retirement age, from 60? For me, I'm 57.
That's
It's
right.
going to be 67 before I can get it. It used to be 65, but now we live longer. What about raising it to, say, 70?
You have to raise the retirement age. You have to bring in more revenue. You have to if you're saving money, if people are paying FICA taxes, that money ought to get a return. on some dollars versus us spending it. That's all part
The
of the
government
reforms.
continues to spend the Social Security tax. They always have.
They always have.
There's not really a trust fund
That's correct.
set aside. That's
correct.
an accounting gimmick, if you would. Should we privatize Social Security, as George Bush said, so that the politicians, the Congresses in the future, can't get their hands on that money?
Well, when Social Security was established, it was a pay-as-you-go system. The workers today paid into the retirement benefits of the receivers. So the lady who first received her first Social Security check never paid into Social Security. But people think that it is a savings program. So whether,
We know it's not.
yeah, we know it's a pay-as-you-go system. So should there be,
Chile privatized their system back in the mid-'80s, and they're doing fabulously well. I mean, in fact, the Eastern European countries went to Chile, not the United States, to say, how do we set up our pension systems?
if you want to keep the government's hands off of it, that's an option. I don't know if we're in a position as a country because of the history to go to that extent. But can you say that money's going to go into government securities in which we're not going to spend? Can we keep our hands off that money? That's all part of Social Security reform. That's all part of the entitlement reforms. But that's where you get the big bang for the buck.
Have you thought about that as a privatizing? I mean, would you be willing to be open to it, or is that something that would be a deal breaker for you?
Well, no, I think what you have to do is you have to maybe look at giving people options. People your age and people my age may be more receptive to other reforms versus someone who's just entering the job market. Now, that someone who's just entering the job market at 23 who looks at Social Security and says, well, I'm not ever going to receive that. What if we move the FICA tax into something that they can control, the government never gets their hands on? You know, we've done that for some public pensions, where we've given the public pensions a right to divert Social Security taxes to a pension fund, whether that be teachers or the like. And the question is, do you give that to the individuals? And that's maybe the options of a buffet line of options.
Well, in fact, the vast majority of pensions, or retirement accounts, whether they're 401k or whether they're formal pension funds, do invest in the stock market.
Well,
I mean, they have some equities,
right.
and their fortunes rise and fall, which is one of the problems we have now because the market's downturn.
Right.
That some of these are.
But there's government securities that are safe. I mean, you get a little less return on the investment, but those are safe and secure with a rate of return that still pays better than a Social Security rate of return.
But, and not to spend it all on that, what about the military if we had, again, it's $600 billion set to be taken from the military budget, but that's over 10 years. I forget the exact number. Do you know offhand the military budget this year? It's approaching $400 billion, I think.
450 or something like that. It's pretty large. And
that-
the problem is,
I mean, if we took $60 billion out of that, would that be once a year for 10 years to get $600 billion? Would
Well,
that be the way to go or not?
well, remember, that's off the top line. So if you do 60 and then you do 60 and then you do 60 and then you do 60, then you're getting a lot. Military people,
One
defense.
presumes the rest of the military budget, though, would also go up and the top line would grow. You know, and not be a static line. So 10 years from now, you might have $500 billion
I
total
don't think
spending.
you can assume that.
Right.
I think that's what 600. Yeah, I think that's,
I'm not arguing for, by the way. I just
No,
wanted
no,
to
no.
say.
These are all things that now the Pentagon's going to have to struggle with.
Leon Panetta says that would devastate the military.
And there's people who are well respected. Remember, he came out of the intel side under this administration. Now he's Secretary of Defense. He is saying that. And we've hollowed the force before, and we almost paid the price because of a hollowed force. So
So if we don't take it out of, would we, and we should point out your military background, you're a West
Right.
Point graduate, you've been, in the National Guard, is it? Or
Army
or
Reserves,
Reserve?
but retired now.
Retired
so
now, but you have a military background. I mean, to the extent you have more of a military background than many in Congress. Should defense also be on the table as far as having cuts made?
Admiral Mullen stated in congressional testimony that the biggest threat to us as a nation is our national debt. So that's why everything has to be placed on the table. Again, that's why we would hope the super committee would have locked themselves in a room and come to some agreement that no one liked, but that would have moved us forward on all the above. Instead of 1.2, go long, 4 trillion, 5 trillion, really affect the debt position and wrestle with these issues. Now we're gonna have to wrestle with them the whole year and the next cycles, but the national debt position, as you look at what's going on in Europe, is unsustainable unless we get serious, and getting serious means everything has to be on the table.
One of the Department of Defense, unlike any other department in the federal government, has their pension system within their budget. The other people, whether it's transportation or ag, have their pension systems outside their budget. Should we set aside the Department of Defense's pension system in a separate category so that when we look at the defense budget, it's actually for personnel, for guns and mission, and we're not having an artificial number in there that's maybe as much as 10% of the entire budget is pensions going to retired military? And let me throw one else out. I'm sorry. If everything's on the budget, you hear some cases where you have some young person who went in maybe to the National Guard at a young age, 17 years old or something. They get 20 years in and they retire at 37 with a pension. Or they get 20 years in and they were qualified. Should we say you get a pension after 20 years in the military, but call us back when you're 60 years old?
Well, and that's, for clarity, no one gets a pension after 20 years unless they're active 20 years in. So they've had to serve 20 years full-time in the service. So maybe a National Guard tech or Air Force, but regular reservists, they only receive their pension at 62.
Right, but you do get some of these people who have been career military, but they start drawing a pension when they're perhaps still in their 30s or early 40s.
That's true, but that's for active. That's not for Guard.
Okay, so let's say for active. Should we change that? Should taxpayers who don't have any pension be paying for someone to retire at 40 years old?
That's part of everything's on the table.
What's a John Shimkus
Everything's
say?
on the table. No, and I'm not trying to evade the question.
Yeah.
I think what you have to, just like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, those people who are at the retirement ages have to be promised that the promises we made to them they keep. How you change the retirement and pension health care benefits for new entries, I think it's fair game. I think the state's done that with its pension bill.
And they're looking to change for current.
And that's what you got to do. If you want to actually reposition so that you have solvency, what happens in major corporate America? Why did GM get in such a problem? Legacy costs. What's legacy costs? Pension and healthcare benefits to the retirees, which sometimes only can get resolved through bankruptcy. Now we don't want to go in that position. So let's look at, so to answer your question, everything's on the table. Should new entries in the military maybe go 25 years before they receive full retirement benefits? Maybe.
Should we, if one of the proposals, if Republican Congressman ABC comes to you and says, the military retirement system itself is underfunded. 20 years ago it was underfunded by $500 billion. If we said, hey, let's not have anyone start to draw a pension until you're 60, is that something John Shimkus would be in favor of, or is that a deal breaker?
Well, I'm not on the Armed Services Committee. I'd have to see what the final package is, but I don't think you're going to punish active military members who, especially in this environment where some have probably gone 6 times overseas in the past 10 years to Afghanistan or Iraq, and then they come to retirement age based upon, in essence, the implied contract when they entered, that you say, oh no, you got to serve 10 more years now.
Although the government will be doing that with Social Security recipients, won't they?
No, we'll have to pass it. It'll have to be debated. And I don't think we'll do anything. Even in the Republican Medicare reform proposal that Paul Ryan put on the table in our budget, said the people who are near retirement age, they can keep the Medicare as described. We're talking about those new entries
The
in the
line
job
might be
market.
drawn maybe when you're 40 or
How old are
below
you?
or something, 57.
Maybe at 57. I don't know what the line is going to be.
You could have a special bill just for me.
That's right.
But I think that's an important point. When we start talking about changing in Social Security, and there was, I would say, an unfair commercial that was put out saying Republicans want to throw grandma off the cliff.
Oh yeah, I saw that commercial.
You know,
It's too extreme. It's not believable.
well, and the other thing is, it's not accurate.
Right.
Any of the reforms that would take place, at least on Social Security, would not take effect for those who are currently receiving it. And I think all those recipients ought to know that.
It's the only thing that's sustainable. I mean, come on, people are smarter than that. Politically, you couldn't do that. I mean, if we're just Machiavellian politicians,
Yeah.
we wouldn't do that because our own self-interest to say we can't survive in that environment. So, I mean, it's kind of a brunt of jokes. We can't believe the commercials, but that's what happens in the political environment. That's what we'll be attacked on.
You know, we'll start to switch. I don't want to spend it all on entitlement reforms, but given that commercial as an example, which is, what does that say about and you've been in Congress since January of '97, I believe.
Right, very good, yeah.
What does that say about the partisanship, the partisan nature? And here we're not getting things done. The Democrats, Republicans are butting heads constantly. Right. The super committee fails. We have these extreme positions as witnessed by that commercial where people are misleading. What's wrong with Congress?
Yeah. Well, Congress is who the public sends. So let's look at why we have a Republican majority with huge numbers. Because the public in the last election cycle said, we're scared of this administration. We've got this new health care plan that we can't afford. We're spending too much. We're going to send a new group of Washington to stop them. And that's what we've done legislatively. Now, the Republicans only control 1/2 of 1/3 of the government. We only control the House of Representatives. We don't control the Senate. We don't control the executive branch. Hence, we have successfully stopped the growth of government, the more borrowing for failed stimulus plans, and the like. And my argument would be, I don't think the majority party in the Senate or the administration has gotten the memo that the people want less government, lower taxes, less spending, and that's why we're blockade. This system will force us to compromise like it did in the Budget Control Act, like it did in the Super Committee. But we may not like the product of the compromise.
Let's switch to the elections then of 2012, because as you say, the Republicans only control the House. The Democrats currently control the Senate. Now, many looking at the Senate races, and the Democrats have far more seats that are open. Many of their incumbent senators have decided not to run. And as we speak today, in the House, Representative Barney Frank, who is long the chairman of the House Financial Services Committee, has announced he will be leaving. What do you think of the Republicans' chances to take control of both houses of Congress? And what would that mean to the voters if that were the case?
Well, I think we'll hold the majority in the House for sure. There's just so many races. The president is on the ballot again, but the Obama seeking re-election is not the Obama who ran for the first cycle in all the categories. I mean,
He's not as popular. He's
not as popular.
He's got a record to defend.
Has a record, and it's not a favorable record. Has ticked off his base by trying to move a little bit to the center sometimes, but then ticks off the center by moving far to the left. It's just he is not the president who even his supporters thought they voted for. So I expect that the wave that brought him into office will not be there, which means a lot of our races, which in areas we'll see less of an Obama wave, and so we'll hold the House.
So if the Republicans take control of Congress, what difference will that make?
Well, by definition, that would mean the Senate, and then the question would be by what numbers, and then we'll be
If you
we'll
had-
be moving on less government, lower taxes, and
Let's
we'll
will we get the Paul Ryan budget passed through the Senate, you think?
You know, as a Senate, it's a strength. I can't speak to the Senate because it needs a supermajority. It has 60 votes to shut down debate. Budgetary things are a little bit different. What I do think we'll have is a movement for lower numbers on the discretionary spending and a real debate on entitlements. A lot of it depend upon the executive branch. And if the Republicans win the presidency, then all the levers will be under the Republican control, and we will be held much more accountable this cycle than we were under the Bush administration, I believe.
A lot of voters, let's call the Tea Party folks, or just fiscal conservatives, were very disappointed when the Republicans had both houses of Congress and the White House, that spending wasn't decreased, that it continued to go. And in fact, the Republicans passed a new entitlement program, Medicare Part D. Will the voters, if they return the Republicans to power in both houses and the White House, should they expect anything different, or will they see government continue to grow?
Yeah, I think what they need to remember is that the government is the government that they elected. Now, in this last cycle, we had 87 new freshman members in the House. 40 of them had never served in any elected office. You can see what they're doing in Washington now, continuing to raise the questions about spending. So I believe it'll be a different conservative Republican Congress. I think you'll have a more conservative Senate than we've ever seen, because a lot of House members have moved over to the Senate, and they're raising Cain over there. So I do expect a different. I can talk through that historical decade and a half of why we did. You had two wars. You had September 11th, and Medicare D was a fiscally prudent process of providing prescription drugs that actually didn't cost us $1 trillion, which if we just paid the bill, but it was a market-driven insurance product that allowed seniors to choose and have a competitive market model. Maybe a model for a health care exchange if you allow some dynamics and citizens' choice in the product that they're getting through private insurance.
Since time grows short, and I want to hit on a couple of other things, let's see. If the Republicans were to take Congress, would you be in favor? I mean, you can't speak for everyone, you're not God,
no.
but would John Shimkus be in favor of throwing out Obamacare or in total, or would you selectively want to keep some of it?
Well, I think the courts will rule even before the election, because it's going to go before the Supreme Court on the individual mandate. I think the individual mandate is unconstitutional, because I don't think that the Founding Fathers ever believed that a national government could tell someone what they had to buy. And we'll see if they rule on that. And if that's the case, there's no, in the law, there's no, I don't know what the legal term is, but there's no, there's nothing that says the whole law should be ruled unconstitutional because they didn't put the proper words in there to protect the rest of the language. Now, can states be involved in offering state exchanges and getting people into an individual market, and can we help for those who can't afford that? Yes, I think there's ways that we can get people covered, but a market approach, not a centralized controlled government approach.
Okay. Let's briefly turn to some areas in your southern Illinois district. One recently, we had a coal ash bill. A lot of people have been saying there's too much regulations. This is another reach of the federal government to control what is called coal ash. You explain your position on that, and why does this bill matter?
Yeah, through my subcommittee, a very important bill. 50% electricity here in the state of Illinois is coal generated, 50% nationally, some states as high as 85%, state of Missouri, state of Indiana. Coal ash has been regulated by the states. This is an overreach by the EPA because of a failed levy, not because of what coal ash is. Coal ash is recycled. It's used in concrete, it's used in particle board, it's used in countertops, and if the EPA is allowed to label it toxic, then what happens to all that secondary use and that recycled? Plus, all this coal ash then has to go in the landfills, which will fill up our landfills. So it is a proper response to an excessive EPA that's trying to regulate and label things toxic that they've already had judgments on that it was not toxic. It's in a response to a levee failure in Tennessee that is an overreach by the EPA.
Where does that process stand now to keep the EPA from imposing those regulations?
The Senate, it's there with about 22 other bills that we're at least waiting for the Senate to decide to do something with. We would call these pro-jobs bills, because they will increase the cost of doing business, which will destroy jobs, or it'll destroy the recycle market for coal ash unless the Senate moves this bill and we send it to the President to get it signed.
So if the Senate does not take that bill up, does the EPA regulations become effective?
That's the risk. And there's uncertainty in the market. And again, we do have, here's an example. Coal ash is used in concrete as a mixture of lighter materials, strengthens it. There's been articles and advertisements from concrete mixture saying no coal ash. Can you imagine if there's MacArthur Extension has coal ash in the concrete? That's here in Springfield. Now, we eventually have to repair that. We take out the concrete. What do we do with that concrete that's mixed with coal ash? Is it a toxic material?
Are you saying that they would require the concrete that's been laid with coal ash to be taken up?
Exactly. And thrown into a toxic landfill. That's the risk of excessive EPA regulations.
Well, that would cost trillions of dollars.
That's our argument.
Lastly, the President the other day, or Senator Durbin the other day just mentioned on Meet the Press that he thought it was time for us to get out of Afghanistan. I'm bouncing around a little bit. You've been there, I believe, to the mission. What do you think? Is it time? Is it time to pull out, or is our mission still critical?
Mission's still critical, but we all want to leave. I mean, we want our soldiers out of Iraq. We want our soldiers out of Afghanistan. The question is when, and do we lose all the time, effort, blood, sweat, and tears and money invested by moving out too fast? I would leave those decisions to the commanders on the ground when they've created a security position in league with the Afghani government and their security forces, and slowly move out. So we all want to leave sooner rather than later. The question is, what would be the return on the investment if we leave too soon? Leave those decisions to the commanders on the ground.
Well, Congressman John Shimkus, the time always goes too fast, but we
That's
covered
right.
a fair amount of territory, and we appreciate you taking the time to speak with us again.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Happy holidays to you.
Happy holidays to you too.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.